Okay, I admit, I'm confused. We had a lot of great feedback from responses from the podcast we recently did on Is S&OP Dead? If you haven't seen it, check that one out. But I'm still confused about the steps of an S&OP process. I've seen anywhere from 15 monthly steps to as little as 4. So who's right? I'm going to tell you. And we're going to show you what the best practice is now. Let's get to it. Welcome. IBF On Demand with your host, Eric Wilson, and your sponsor, your one-plan S&OP software solution, Arkiva. Happy to have you on board. And guess what? It's my birthday. So this is actually airing, if this is going to be my birthday week when this is airing, so please, it's not the thought that counts, it's the gift. So if you can, because it's my birthday and I'm asking you, you need to like this podcast, comment down below, tell me happy birthday. That's what I want to hear because I'm lonely, I'm by myself, and I need to hear that from people to make me feel a little bit better about myself. So please, tell me happy birthday. That's what I'm asking for you today. And you want to send gifts, feel free as well. And don't worry, even if it's not this week, it's a year later when you're viewing this, you can still send me something. I'm always up for good gifts. This is another great episode of IBF On Demand, and we're going to be talking about S&OP today. And I said I was a little bit confused. We had some great feedback from the last podcast we did, but that got into more questions exactly about the process. And what exactly is this S&OP process on a monthly basis? Because there's a lot of ambiguity about it. I said I've seen anywhere from as far as 15 different steps that incorporated anything and everything part of a business process to just a simple 4-step process. Everything in between. If you want to look at what the traditional S&OP process was back in the early 90s, it was an easy stair-step process, 5 basic steps: data gathering, demand planning, supply planning, a pre-S&OP, and executive S&OP. And you still see that a lot of times, especially in training. People go back to the way it's always been taught. But is that the right way to do it and teach it now? And I wanted to find that out. And like I do with anything when I want to try to find out, I go to the experts. I go to the companies that are best in class right now. I go to the people that's training and teaching this on a daily basis. And I get all that feedback and come back and I present it to you. And that's what I did with this as well. I asked the experts. I asked a lot of, the top companies, some of the top people in the field, and I got a lot of responses. And surprisingly, despite all the different things you can find out there about the different types of S&OP processes, they were all pretty much the same. Most of the top companies are doing things the same way. And most of the people that understand this and are teaching it have adapted and are starting to teach it a very similar way as well. One of those conversations I had was with one of the experts, I think, in S&OP IBP process. And we had a very long phone conversation. And somewhere in that phone conversation, we said, I need to share this with the audience as well. That's when I decided to bring Pat Bauer on. Pat Bauer to be able to talk about S&OP IBP process, and that's what we're going to do today. Me and him going to try to recreate that conversation. It said it was a 2-hour conversation. Don't worry. We're not going to hold you in for 2 hours. We got about 10 minutes of exciting content wrapped up in 30 minutes, so stay tuned. So we're going to talk a lot about S&OP and exactly what are those steps. Pat is a valued and frequent writer and speaker on supply chain subjects. He is recognized S&OP expert and self-professed S&OP nerd. Prior to Combe, he served as a practice manager and supply chain planning and S&OP at a boutique supply chain consulting firm, as well as he's a practitioner of many large organizations. He even worked a little bit of time at a supply chain software company. It was a full gamut, anywhere from consulting, technology, to large organizations. He was recognized 4 times by Supply and Demand Chain Executive magazine as a pro to know, and Consumer Goods Technology magazine considered him one of their visionaries. He was the recipient of the inaugural IBF's Excellent in Business Forecasting and Planning Award, as a self-professed S&OP nerd. To me, an S&OP expert, Pat Bauer. As I said, I'm honored to have Pat. Pat, welcome aboard. I said I am honored to have you, the S&OP nerd, to talk about this. So welcome.
Thank you.
I have a question. I said I'm confused, and you get to help unconfuse me. So my question is exactly how many steps are in an S&OP practice, or how many licks does it take to get to a middle of a Tootsie Roll Tootsie Pop?
I'm not sure I have the answer to the Tootsie Pop question. And the S&OP steps really kind of depends. I mean, different processes and different schools of thought have different counts. So I've seen people with 8-step processes, 4-step processes, 11-step processes, and 5. Those are the ones that come to mind off the top of my head. 2 most common models are sort of the Tom Wallace, Bob Stahl model, which has, 4.5 steps: a data prep, a demand planning consensus conversation, a supply planning session, or balancing process, and an executive review. Sometimes on some of those models, they're typically depicted in a stair-step fashion. Some of the models have like a pre-step, a pre-meeting to discuss any issues raised in the meetings prior. And then there's sort of the Ollie White step. And if you go to conferences, you'll occasionally see it. And it's sort of a circle diagram. It starts with an executive review at top, going clockwise to a demand review, then a supply balancing meeting or a portfolio review, and then an integrated reconciliation or a pre-S&OP meeting. And it's sort of a complete loop. And I think both processes are loops. They're just not necessarily depicted as such. One seems more stair-step, and it just sort of drops off, and the other sort of closes the gaps. But it's really kind of a monthly iterative looping process. So what's the loop? At the top, when you have an executive review, what comes down are decisions, and decisions that funnel down to supply planning for their inventory planning purposes, demand planning for some watchouts and some concerns, portfolio management for acceleration or deceleration of products that are in the pipeline. There's a strategy that loops back. So the question really is, it depends. And then in execution, you find all different variations on a theme. Some companies are so capacity bound that you won't see what really resembles a demand planning meeting. They are essentially selling to capacity. And you see this in like industrial chemicals and where they're essentially selling time on a reactor vessel and how much product you can get out. And then there's consumer goods companies where it seems like they're almost overweighted towards demand review. Seems to be more of a demand planning process, and it just feeds the process in consumer goods because people are pulling in trade inventory, point of sale data, extrinsic data on econometrics and whatever, on weather. Like, people are pulling in all different facts that would otherwise alter the spending pattern of consumers. So it tends to feel very demand centric. And supply review or the balancing process seems to be kind of like an afterthought, something that the supply geeks go and do. It's not something that's really part of a process. So in execution, there's all different levels of maturity inside that process. I'm not sure if it explains it, but I hate using weasel words, and the weasel word or expression that really comes to mind is it depends. Like, it really depends on the business, on the industry, and how deep you want to go in your maturity journey to bring the S&OP forward. I think that's the real answer here.
Yeah, it depends is my favorite answer, so don't feel bad about that. I said I actually saw a product-centric company that actually had a, you're talking about a supply demand kind of dominant. I'd seen one that was product dominant as well. You mentioned the Bob Stahl, Tom Wallace, kind of the original traditional 5 stair step from the early 90s. Is that, that was kind of what everybody, really benchmarked to for the longest time. Is that still a good model, or has it started to adapt now with what we're seeing in data and other types of processes now?
I think that's a perfectly fine standard. I mean, they're cast a little bit different. The original, sort of the Bob Stahl, I keep on saying Bob Stahl, the Tom Wallace Bob Stahl model was very, very, it felt very supply focused at one point in time. Felt very, very master planning, MRP-esque, grow it up from the supply centered company type of perspective, where the Ollie White model, and they're not necessarily done at different times. They were done kind of coincident with each other. It was just different philosophies. As a matter of fact, I think both Bob and Tom worked at Ollie White at one point in time. I think they came out of the Ollie White school. But they had their own take on it, and it was a very supply-centered take, very executive-focused take. They were talking strategy before a lot of other people were talking about the strategic integration. So you ask Bob today, and he'll talk about it's an executive process with a small e. So.
Yep. Now, the one thing I've noticed though different, that you mentioned very supply focused MRP. It was the early 90s. Yeah. And in the early 90s, data gathering was an actual step, was a process you had to go through on a monthly basis for an S&OP. I think that's somewhat changed, because the 2 biggest things I see best practices and what companies are doing today. If you look at the Coca-Colas, look at Combe, look at a lot of these companies that are really best in class when it comes to S&OP, you aren't seeing that data gathering as a process step right now. And the other piece is you're seeing product review as a new step in this process. Is that true?
So I'm going to agree and disagree with you a little bit. So I think the demand planning process that feeds the demand review is about as intensive a data gathering process as you'll find today and in the past. I've been preaching this notion of intimacy at an item level and a customer level. Every demand planner should know who the major customers are for any of the A items and some of the B items. That should have that depth of knowledge. How do you get that? Through analysis. Where do you do that analysis? You're kind of dissecting demand before the demand consensus meeting, and you're putting out what you think is it's a demand planner led process that really digs and deep dives in on what's happening. So I've always been a proponent that data then and now is no different. You're still pulling trade inventory data. You're still pulling POS data. You're still pulling a ton of data. On the supply side, you're pulling schedule adherence and inventory values. And so there's a whole bunch of data collection that's happening now. Is it easier? Maybe a little bit easier. I'm not sure it's dramatically easier than it once was. And there are BI tools, and there's a lot of things that help get you data a little bit quicker. But getting data quicker and the democratization of data doesn't necessarily replace the analytics that happen. The analytics that happen, the observations that happen in a demand planner's head or a supply planner's head. It's like, okay, so this happened, but why did it happen? And what questions help me understand why my schedule adherence is low, or why a particular item grew faster than it was otherwise expected. Those things are still happening, and that's where demand planners and supply planners really add their value into the process. As for portfolio management, I've been talking about portfolio management for 20 years. It's not something that's really new. You see it a little bit more now because SKUs are just proliferating like crazy. And people have a lot of different theories, but I'll give you one really simple theory around why SKUs are proliferating right now. E-commerce. It doesn't have to go much further than that. There are people offering different packaging and different package designs to serve the e-commerce marketplace. And that if you take a regular open stock item that you sell into Walmart and you now convert it for e-commerce Amazon as a 3-pack or differentiated 1-pack or some sort of special value proposition, that's what's happening in the marketplace today. That's why SKUs are growing dramatically. And that's why inventory turn numbers look unusual compared to what they did 10 years ago even. So there's a lot going on there. So yes, there is a proliferation of SKUs. Portfolio management does become more important in there. I'll tell you, demand planning becomes very important in there. Well, how do you peg demand for all these new differentiated packages serving a completely new channel? So it's an interesting place that we're at right now. It's an ever-changing marketplace, and I'm not sure what it ends up being on the back end of this. And COVID, I think, has precipitated more of a push into e-commerce, not less, obviously. So I have an Amazon box that shows up at my door every single day. So I'm as guilty as the rest of the world. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, Eric.
Yeah, it did. So we definitely have portfolio as a intricate part of a best practice S&OP, mature S&OP process now. When you're looking at that data, you did a great job explaining that. And, I think we are a little more dynamic now. You can look at daily instead of monthly in some cases, or even hourly in some cases now with some organizations. But you mentioned that the analytics that's done with that data, and there's a lot of other things that's done outside of an S&OP process. And when we had our call, you mentioned too many people try to overcomplicate the S&OP process and put those as steps, put those as part of an S&OP. You had a great infographic that kind of laid that out. And in your words, all the other shit that happens outside of the standard process, would that be the data? Would that be the analytics? Would that be the MRP, capacity planning? That be the finance, financial reconciliation? That would be the strategy, all those pieces. So talk about what's as far as a basic S&OP, and then what's all the outside stuff.
Sure. So well, let's just start with the demand review. In front of the demand review, there's a whole demand planning exercise that happens for the first, 5 to 10 days of every month, where your demand planner is going and digging into all the detail behind what happened inside of the prior month's demand. In front of a portfolio review process, there's all the conversations that happen, whether they're stage and gate or pre-launch or project planning around new product introductions or product renovations like a new formulation or product renovations like new packaging. All of that happens in front of a portfolio meeting, where the portfolio review meeting is really a summarization of all those activities and a progress check against it. Supply and demand balancing process, that is really the heart. The supply review requires some amount of DRP, MRP, sourcing work, and most importantly, a rough cut capacity planning exercise, especially for those businesses that are capacity bound. That happens in front of that meeting. So all of the tools that are out there right now that are available to use for S&OP really just facilitate that data gathering and some of the initial generation of a plan. It's like a statistical plan is a good plan theoretically from a demand planning perspective, but sometimes the math is bad. Sometimes the results are counterintuitive, and a demand planner has to say, yeah, no, that doesn't work. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens outside of the 4 steps or the 5 steps that happens in front of those processes that really drive the inputs and the conversation inside of those review meetings. And that's what people just don't understand. Everyone's sort of obsessed with, how many meeting numbers or the number of meetings or the naming of the meetings. And honestly, that's not the conversation. It's how well are you integrating back into those other processes, and how much data gathering and insight are you bringing forward into those meetings? And a lot of companies really fail on the data insight part.
Okay. So with that, I mean, I think what you're saying is people try to put everything into the S&OP process, try to solve their, supply, MRP, DRP, left cut capacity, demand, life cycle management, everything into an S&OP. Those are residual, daily, tactical, operational, sometimes strategic even processes that's done
Right.
outside that helps feed a strong S&OP process, is what you're saying.
Right. There's a whole bunch of garbage that happens outside um,
Okay.
of the 5 steps, and that garbage is an unbelievably important to driving the conversation. And I say garbage, I don't mean
Yeah.
pejorative way. It's just there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. People's everyday work and everyday jobs that happen that end up feeding the process. I think people think that S&OP is just a 5-step process, and boy, that thinking is so far off and wrong. Like, let's sort of have a really simple conversation. Everyone talks about S&OP being a strategic process. Where's the strategy from? How does that link and how does that connect? Someone has set a strategy, and someone has, on the commercial side of the business, let's just say someone set a route to market strategy, which is the channels we want to go after, the pricing inside of those channels. And, do we want to work the dollar class of trade as an example, or do we want to work the drug class of trade? All of those decisions happen offline, but that's the strategy of the business. And the demand plan should reflect that, and the product plan should reflect those strategies and should connect forward. Similarly, the commercial strategy, the products that you want to make, sort of work in the product part of the 4Ps and sort of marketing parlance. That should connect right into your stage and gate process, into your pre-launch process, into your project planning process, and that should have direct connection into your portfolio management. People don't connect how strategy aligns inside of S&OP, but it's really kind of very simple. And the infographic that you talk about tries to illustrate those connections.
That was a great, and even I can understand that now. So thank you. So I think what we looked at then is we have a product review or portfolio review.
Yeah.
We have a demand review. We have a supply review. We have an executive S&OP or executive review. And then a lot of people put this pre-S&OP or reconciliation or gap analysis in there as well. So basically those would be the new 5 steps, or pretty much the traditional 5 steps just modernized for 2020.
Sure. And yes, you talk about the integrated reconciliation of that pre-meeting. What that does gathers the other 3 meetings together. What are the issues, gaps to plan, problems, and it tries to work through solutions, both financial solutions and practical solutions, to sort of overcome those issues.
So I think in my simple world, then, you're looking at a basic process, and it's not meetings. There are a process. It's not everything you do inside the company. It helps enable you to do the other things you do in the company. Yep. So it enables, decision making. It enables the other functional processes to work better. And it becomes a decision making forum for those collaboration is what happens then.
Right. Well, what we know most people rarely talk about is the loop back. So you go through all these steps and processes. Now you have to loop it back. So what do you loop back? Inventory target levels. You loop back the demand plan into supply review. Capacity and production prioritization decisions. Make this product over that product. Make those sort of decisions inside of the S&OP process, but there has to be a loop back into those functional, everyday, tactical operations and systems. What's at the top of the planning stack in every company that has an ERP is a forecast. That forecast has to cascade down through DRP, master planning, MRP. It has to cascade through. So the demand plan as an output of S&OP feeds all those other applications and systems that drive decision-making at a very tactical and execution level.
Okay, I only have a couple minutes left. Unfortunately, I said we talked for a couple hours last week, so we could go on and on. But we only have a couple more minutes for this podcast. About 20-30% of the audience I know, hearing from them, and statistically, they're starting a new process. Yeah. So we laid out, okay, here's very mature companies, here's best practices. You gave a lot of great insights in there. I'll probably share your infographic if you don't mind. I can give them that visual as well. But those 20% of the companies getting ready to start something, where should they start with the 5-step? Should they start with, one? Where do they start?
I'm not a big boil the ocean guy, so I think you start with demand and start centering your operations around demand and getting a good demand plan. A bad demand plan creates bad supply plans. A good demand plan has the opportunity to create either a good or bad supply plan. So you're giving yourself an advantage by starting with demand. And then from there, you work your balancing process. In your balancing process, you can gradually extend the horizon. So make it the next 2 or 3 months, and then make it the next year forward, and then make it the next 18 months, but extend the horizon. I think you have the opportunity to succeed more if you start with demand and then cascade through supply, no different than the planning stack you see at a tactical level.
So you don't start your S&OP process with all 5 steps in place and a strict, rigid formula for success. You always start where they're at.
Some people will say that that's what you do. I just disagree. I went through the demand review process and put in an executive review to talk about the demand review and gradually mature the conversation about all the drivers of demand, and then start integrating supply. And then integrate portfolio somewhere along the way. I think portfolio is a more mature conversation that has to happen.
I agree 100%. I think that's a great thing to end it on right there. And hopefully, I know it. We don't. We actually agree on this one there, Pat. So, see, I'm coming around to your side of it. That's what it is.
There you go.
So I hopefully you inspired, some of those 20-30% to go out and, at least start where they are, start with a demand review, start with something simple, and then, build from there at their own pace if need be. So great advice.
I think boiling the ocean can be an overwhelming, it's a daunting task. And if you look at how comprehensive S&OP is, it can scare the bejesus out of you. I think if you take it really simple and easy and start with demand and then build from there, I think it'll lead to long-term success and a lot of affirmation as you build successes along the way.
Yep. So thank you very much, Pat, for being part of this. That definitely provided some good insights, more than I could have done myself. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for posing the question. This is a fun question to talk to.
It was a fun, and I'm sure I'll talk to you again sometime.
All right, Eric.
Bye. That was a fantastic conversation I just had with Pat. I said, we had the great conversation last week. I wanted to share it with you. Hopefully you got something out of it as well. Just remember, S&OP, it's a process, not a meeting. S&OP is a decision-making forum. It's not a reporting forum. And S&OP drives your business needs, not just supply chain. Keep those things in mind, and when you're putting together your steps, your forecast, your process, your S&OP process inside your organization, whatever it may be, whether it's going to be a simple 4-step, whether you want to make it complicated and put 10 steps in it. Much like the S&OP name, I personally, despite what anybody else said, I don't care what you call it. As long as you make it a business process to enable business decisions, I'm okay. And with that, when you're looking at those process steps, meet the company where it is. And what I mean by that is I've seen organizations that started off in finance and built a strong S&OP process. I've seen organizations have a good demand planning function and looking at it as a demand planning process and then build out an S&OP process from that. I've seen an organization that actually started with a product review meeting first and then built an S&OP process out of that product review. Yes, they had what I mean by meeting the company where it is, that organization had a very strong product management group focus. They had a lot of products that they would put out on a weekly, daily, monthly basis. They had a large portfolio they had to manage. Because of the type of organization, they were a product-focused, centric organization. Because of that, they already had an established product review meeting on a monthly basis. That it wasn't an S&OP, it was a product review. So what they did was they adapted that more into a S&OP type product review that brought in more functions, brought in more demand, brought in finance, brought in these other functions that they were impacting, and they built out that meeting to become a strong product review. From there came a demand review, then became a supply resource review where they could react to that, ultimately cultivating into an executive review they started to establish on a monthly basis as well. So they met the organization where they were to build out these steps. So what you want to do as a steps, yes, I'll give you we had the best practices. We know what the 4 or 5 steps are as the best practice. But what they are to you, adapt to where you are in your organization. And then build on those competence. The basics, product review, a demand review, a supply or resource review, whatever you want to call it, and then an executive review. Those are the basic tenets. Build upon those. Fill in the gaps. Do all that other stuff outside of those if you want. But those are the basic tenets. Make sure you get right first. That's the best practice. You heard I didn't mention the pre-S&OP. Yes, it can be a step, and it is a step for a lot of organizations. And the reason I kind of left out is because of the, probably about 20, 30 companies that I talked to, best in class, about half of them had a pre-S&OP, or some had it by a different name. It's an important step if you need it. If you need that pre-S&OP reconciliation, by all means, you need to have that as part of your, if it needs to be a financial reconciliation, use it. If it needs to be a category roll-up before you go into an enterprise executive S&OP, use it for that. It has a lot of different flavors and different ways you can actually approach that pre-S&OP step. So utilize it, once again, how it best fits your organization. As far as the data gathering, you already heard, we're no longer presenting that as a step. That's dynamic. That's daily process now. That is every part of your process, no matter where you are and what you're doing. Same with inventory. Same with finance. These are intricate parts and integrated into every part of your process nowadays. That's what best practice is doing today. It's really integrating those data gathering, financial reconciliation, inventory, those aspects into all parts. And with that, you really, when I say it's a process, not a meeting, you really need to look at not just a product review and then that's aside. Really, product is part of every meeting. There was some fast-moving consumer goods that actually had product. They didn't have a product review, but they had it as a part of the demand review, as a part of their supply and resource gaps, and part of their executive S&OP because product was so important. So understand that you really are bringing those parts into every process as well. That brings us to an end of another IBF On Demand. I said, I'm your host, Eric Wilson. Please contact me, eric@ibf.org. It's eric@ibf.org. Check out Arkiva, your one-plan S&OP software solution. Thank them for sponsoring it. And if there's anything we can do for you, one of the things we can looking at an S&OP audit, you want to exactly see where your S&OP stands up. If you want to see where your S&OP is compared to these benchmarks, S&OP is compared to other organizations. If you want to know those things, reach out to IBF. We got an audit we can do for you. Very easy. Gives you exactly where you are as far as a benchmark and a maturity opposed to these best practices, opposed to other organizations. So you can put yourself up against these other best in class and see exactly how you measure up. Thank you all once again. And with that, we come to an end of an IBF On Demand. Thank you very much for watching to the end. I'll check you out next time. And don't forget, wash your hands.